Now that we know the theory, it's time for us to create a real AwareIM application. If you haven't watched the first part of the tutorial that describes the AwareIM development methodology, please watch it now before proceeding any further with the practical part. The application that we will be developing will manage a public library. It will be a very simplified version of a real library management system. However, this example should demonstrate very well the methodology that we spoke about in the first part of the tutorial. It should also give you a very good practical idea on how to work with AwareIM. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing we need to do, according to our methodology, is to describe how business works and where in this business our application fits in. Our simplified version of the library management business will include the following. The library should store items of different types: books, CDs, video. The items should be available for everyone to see. Anyone should be able to borrow an item from the library. To borrow an item, a person needs to be a registered member of the library. To become a registered member, a person needs to provide his personal details, and the staff member needs to record these details. Obviously, only items not borrowed by other members should be available for other members to borrow. A member can only borrow a new item if he doesn't have more than 5 items that he had already borrowed but not returned yet. When an item is offered to a library member, a staff member needs to record which item has been borrowed, by whom, the date of the loan, and the return date of the item. When a library member returns the item, the staff member needs to make a record that the item has been returned and return the item to the storage. If a member has not returned the item on a due date, a staff member needs to remind the library member about his loan, either by calling the member or sending him an email or fax or any other communication method available. Note that the above description does not mention anything about our application. It just describes how this business works, and in theory, everything could be done manually without any involvement of computers or software. Obviously, we are developing the application to make this business more efficient. So how does the application fit in, and how will it improve the business? Well, for this simple business, it is quite obvious what the application should do. It should allow keeping electronic records of all items in the library. It should allow keeping electronic records of all library members with all relevant details. It should allow keeping electronic records of all loans that a member has made. It should automatically check the number of existing loans for the member and reject a new loan if the member has more than 5 items borrowed already. It should allow a staff member to electronically mark an item as returned when the member returns the item. It should automatically send a reminder email to the members if they haven't returned an item by the due date. Note that the above requirements do not mention anything on how the system should do this, what will be the user interface, and all the details of the process. This description just identifies problems that the system should solve. For example, it is tedious for a staff member to find out if an item is late and then call members to remind them about the loan. It is much more efficient if this is done automatically by the software. Similarly, it is tedious to have paper records of items, loans, and members. It is much more efficient if the software keeps these records electronically and allows very fast search of the items, members, and loans. The next step, according to our methodology, is to create a model of our application. And the first step is to identify business objects. Well, if we read the description of the business, it is quite obvious which business objects we are going to have. we're going to have the item object representing the item of the library, the library member or just member, the loan object, and the staff member. Let's now enter these objects into ORAM. So I will create a new business space. And I will start adding the business objects, starting with the item object. We have to give it a name and start adding the attributes. We're going to have the title of the item, the author, the code. This will be the unique code of the item, the type of the item, and here we have choices: book, CD, or video. We're going to have picture, and then we will have a special flag which indicates whether the item is available or not. Okay, so the author will be a required attribute, and the length will be 60. The code will also be required, as well as the type. And the item available will be calculated with the initial value of no. Alright, so we finished creating the item object now. Let's now define the member object. It will have the following attributes: name, address, membership number, this will be a unique number of the member, and the phone number. Name will be required, address will be required as well, membership number will be calculated, and it will be automatically incremented by the system. This object should also have a mandatory email address, because we want the system to send emails to the member. I will add an email communication channel to the object, and this will automatically add the email address attribute. We need to do this in order to send emails to the member. For more details, please watch the emails tutorial. So as you can see here, the system has automatically added the email address attribute. I will just make it mandatory. Let's now define the loan object, representing the fact that some member has borrowed some item from the library. We will have the following attributes: loan date This is the date when the item was borrowed. Due date. This is the date when the item is due. Return date. The date when the item was actually returned. And status, which will be either current or past. If the loan has already been returned, we will still keep record of it and change its status to past. So the choices here will be current and past with the initial value of current. The loan date will have an initial value of current date. And the return date will also be a calculated attribute, because we will have a rule that will calculate this date automatically. I will explain this a little bit later. Before we move forward, let's go back to the member object, where I forgot to format the membership number attribute. We want to pad this number with zeros. So let's add this format to the member. Let's now add the staff member object. We will keep it very simple for now and just add name and address attributes. Alright, the next step in our methodology is to identify relationships between business objects. For this simple application, these relationships are quite obvious. Let's start with the member-loan relationship. A member can have multiple loans, but every loan belongs only to one member. Let's enter this relationship into our AM. For more details on how to do this, please watch the relationships tutorial. We will add the attribute called loans to the member object. The type of the attribute will be loan. The multiple allowed will be ticked. We will also create a matching attribute on the loan object called member. When we save the member object and go to the loan object, we will see that our AM has automatically created the matching member attribute. By default, multiple allowed is checked, but since the loan object can only belong to one member, we have to untick it. Now let's define loan item relationship. A loan can only be for one item, and the loan should store the item that it is for. So we must have an item attribute of the type item in the loan object. We may or may not want to create a matching attribute on the item object for all loans that the item is or has been part of. While it is important for the loan to know which item it is for, it is not really necessary for an item to know which loans it is or has been part of. I will, however, create a matching attribute called loans on the item object. Is there a relationship between member and the item? There is, but it is an indirect one. If a member borrowed an item, there is a relationship between the member and the item. However, we already have a loan object, and the member knows about his loans, and the loan knows about its item. Therefore, through the loan, the member knows about the borrowed item, so there is no need to create this relationship explicitly. It is always available through the loan object. It is important that we do not define relationships that can be deduced from other relationships. Otherwise, our model can become quite messy. The next step is to define business rules for our objects. For more details about business rules, please watch the business rules tutorial. Let's start with the rules of the item object and define a rule that would calculate whether the item is available or not. The rule can be written like this. So if the number of loans in the current state for the current item is 0, then it's available. Otherwise, it is not. Let's add another rule that will validate the item's code to make sure that it is unique, meaning that there are no other items already in the system with the same code. The rule will look like this. Here we take all items other than the current item and compare their code with that of the current one. Let's now look at the loan object. First of all, let us define a rule that will reject the loan if the item that the loan refers to is not available. The rule will only execute for a new loan that is being created and will therefore look like this. Let's now add a rule that will reject the loan if the member already has 5 borrowed items. The rule will also only execute for loans that are being created, and it will look like this. Here we're counting only loans that belong to the member of the current loan, or this loan, and which are also in the current state. Let's now add a rule that will calculate the default due date of the loan. By default, it will be 5 days after the date when the item was borrowed, but the operator will also be able to change the default manually. The rule will look like this. And finally, we will add a rule that will calculate the return date of the loan. Once the item is returned, an operator will change the status of the loan to past. So when this happens, we will set the return date automatically. The rule will look like this. When the status of the loan is changed to past, the return date will be assigned the current date. It is important to note that all these rules are completely independent of the user interface. They will execute no matter how the users work with the system. They represent business logic of their application, which states how the business is supposed to work, irrespective of the user interface. We have now completed the most important part of the application, the model. So now our model is ready, and we can proceed to the next step and think about the user interface of the system. This will be explained in the next tutorial.